Welcome everyone to what we've started calling Co-Creative's Thought Leader series. Our thought leader today is Dr. Hassan Batts. You'll learn more about Dr. Batts and his work. We're specifically diving into the topic of trauma and the role of healing in systems change. This is going to be an interesting conversation with Hassan because we could have we could have all day conversations just about trauma, just about healing, just about systems change. But we said, well, let's just mash it all together in 90 minutes and see what comes up. So we're going to be exploring together. We have in our webinars some interactive portions using polling tools. We have some small group discussion here. We're going to try a fishbowl format and invite some of you to join a more intimate conversation. And we're going to start with some introductions and sharing a little bit about who's on the call. And then Dr. Batts is going to share some of his thinking about trauma and the role of healing and systems change. A few things before we get started. We encourage people to share what you want of your lives and homes. So if you have kids, cats, guinea pigs, gerbils, dogs, whatever's happening in the background, could even be dirty laundry. Let's welcome all of that. Let's welcome real life into this session here and make it so we can all show up and experience part of what Dr. Batts is going to talk about, the experience of radical welcome. The session is 90 minutes. I only say that because sometimes people think webinars are always an hour, but we feel that 90 minutes gives us a bit more time to do some of the interaction, some of the deeper discussion and sharing that folks typically want to do. And you're welcome to tweet. We ask that you not attribute things without someone's permission. But if you'd like to tweet highlights or quotes or your own reflections, if you'd like to, we'll give you some Twitter connections. There's We Are Co-Creative at the bottom. And Hassan, yours is Doc Batts, correct? At Doc, D-O-C. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is a little bit about Co-Creative. Our website link is at the bottom there, so feel free if you want to know more to connect there, and you can find lots of tools and resources that we give away to help people who are leading collaborations and working to change complex systems. It's a little bit challenging to introduce Dr. Hassan Batts. There are many dimensions to this man. And you'll see some of them listed here, and you'll see lots of different roles that Doc Batts has played and is playing in his life, and particularly in the various communities that he's a part of. So you can see more information at hassanbatts.com about Dr. Batts and his work, and you can you'll also receive all the materials, not just the recording, but the slide deck from this webinar as well. So that will be available to you. So I think I'll turn it over to Melissa Darnell from the Co-Creative team here for some introductions.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you, Russ. I am Melissa, the one who has been emailing you as we've been previewing this opportunity and preparing. So it's so lovely to associate some names with some faces this morning. I am the training lead here at Co-Creative, and I'm going to support some introductions. So as I indicated in the email that I sent, we're going to ask you to browse over to slido.com. Where you'll see a survey that's populating. It's going to ask you for a code, which I'm going to put here in the chat as well. The code is HEALING. Okay, we see people from Bellingham, Portland, Massachusetts, United Kingdom, Michigan, London, Hawaii, Jersey in the house, New York, Iowa, Canada. Some more people from the UK, Chico, Honolulu, Vermont, Michigan, Switzerland. Thank you for being here on your holiday. Saskatchewan, more folks from Canada, Zimbabwe, Pennsylvania, Montana, Eureka, California, Ohio, the British Interplanetary Society. Well-represented time zones. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for the live session.
Seen.
Hassan, you've asked this question of groups before. I'm wondering what stands out to you from what you're seeing here.
Yeah, seen is huge. I mean, you see it. The more people say it, the larger the word gets, right? And they're all beautiful words. Seen, connected, accepted, whole, loved, warm, ease, open, free. This is aligned with what we've heard as we do this work around radical welcome. And we're gonna keep talking about the fact that when people feel welcome, they show up different. So when we think about the spaces and the systems and the organizations and just the places that we are and how we want to be able to show up and want people to be able to show up, I mean, these words really resonate and create something different than what we've seen in many spaces that we've been in.
It's beautiful.
I'm wondering if someone from Hawaii would mind unmuting and sharing what hau'oli means.
Happy.
Mm-hmm.
They wrote it in the chat box.
All right. Thank you for connecting us, Melissa. Let's just take a moment of silence here. I was going to show you a scene of some forest or something, but looking at this, I think this is the place for a moment of silence. Maybe let's just reflect on what we're all seeing here in terms of this experience of feeling truly welcomed. We'll just take a minute of silence. All right. To share briefly here the flow for today's session. Hassan's going to share some of the thoughts, as I mentioned, on trauma, healing, and this idea and practice of radical welcome. And then we're going to do a fishbowl discussion, and we'll describe what that is. Some of you may have done it before. And just share not just themes and insights, but maybe also some examples and stories of whether it's trauma, healing, radical welcome, whatever's standing out to folks. Then we'll get into some small group discussions, sharing some high point experiences around times when we each felt radically welcomed. And then we have an exercise of, I guess, imagination, and it could be about intention, of kind of exploring what systems would look like if enough people understood and embodied the behaviors that support radical welcome. And then we'll share a few other resources, and that, I think, will bring us to the end of today's webinar. Okay, so we're going to turn on a poll in Slido. And as we're moving forward here, this poll will remain active. So if you browse to slido.com and enter the code healing if you haven't already, you'll see an open poll there, and all it says is what's standing out to you. And you'll note that if you can both submit items to the poll, and you can also upvote things that other people submitted. So as Hassan talks about trauma, healing, radical welcome, and then as we go into the fishbowl, we're going to keep this poll open and then revisit it at some point to see what's emerging in the group in terms of what's standing out to us about these experiences and ideas. If you have any problems accessing the poll or any other technical issues with Zoom, please in the Zoom chat send a chat message to Melissa and she can help you. All right, Dr.
Thank you.
Batts.
So we are going to cover 40 hours worth of work in about 15 minutes. We're just going to channel this and go at this together, right? I want to start by asking the elders for permission to begin. So if you can just throw me a thumbs up or something in the chat box, you know, we always want to get permission from the elders to start. Thank you. And we start with this Ubuntu principle. That is, I am because we are, therefore because we are, I am. So what we're really talking about today is we're talking about the interconnectedness, right? This community that exists. And there's these ideas that want us to focus on individualism in our work, individualism in our lives, and individualism in our families. You can go to the next slide. But the work that we're talking about is really grounded in this interconnectedness, that I am because we are, therefore because we are, I am. Yo soy porque nosotros somos. So we have a model that we developed that's called TREE. And the idea is that we teach through modeling and through demonstration. So when we talk about things like compassion, when we talk about things like respect, when we talk about these ideas that they can't be taught, they have to be modeled through demonstration and through story. So we use a lot of storytelling, right? And TREE stands for trauma-informed care, restorative practices, emotional intelligence, and equity. And our work has shown us, and our experience has shown us that you can't do one without the other. We always want to compartmentalize. People will call us in and say, oh, we need a consultant around trauma-informed care. But they haven't and don't want to do the work around equity. Or today, right, where the world is currently at, people want to call us in and say, we want to do this work around equity. But they don't understand the role of trauma, they don't understand the role of restorative practices, and they don't understand the emotional intelligence, kind of the self and others, how my experiences and my perceptions and my biases impact the way that I treat others and the way that our system shows up, because systems are made up of people, right? So we know that systems will always reflect the systems, programs, practices, rules, laws will reflect the values of the people that design them. So we keep that in mind. The systems are made up of individuals and you cannot separate them. They're interconnected. Next slide. Healing occurs in authentic relationships and within communities. Healing occurs in authentic relationships and within community. And that's at the foundation of it. So we often want to set up these workspaces or these teams or these organizations or these systems that are transactional, without recognizing that, again, systems are made up of human beings, and that although we try to do all of our work here, that there's a part of the heart that has to be incorporated. It's not all science and it's not all art. So how do we find that balance? Next slide. And it's grounded in story. So we know that everyone has a story to tell. And what we're talking about there is that systems are made up of people, and that when I enter a space or I enter a role, that I bring 45 years of experiences with me. I bring 45 years of values with me. And that's where the clash has happened. There's this Eurocentric value of being present or future centric, right? Of not adding value to the past, of the experiences of the people that came before us, or even the experiences that I've had that I brought to the table, that what makes me me, right? So there's the story that the individuals carry, there's the story I carry into these spaces, and then there's also, every system has a story. There are people that have poured into it, there are people that have created the norms that exist, and they've brought the trauma with them that they've experienced, and they've brought the healing practices, and oftentimes we even bring maladaptive behaviors with us that show up. So when we think about the pain points in the systems that we work with, they come from the people that have designed and continue to perpetuate the norms within the system. Next slide. And our role is often to affirm people's stories, to recognize it, and to create spaces where we can be our full selves. Russ kind of started us with that, you know, like, don't worry about the books that are disorganized in the background, like, have all of me show up, have my kids come into the room, my children are part of my story. And then there's this idea of you can't fix what ain't broke. So I have elders that tell me you are perfect, whole, and complete. And how do I enter spaces? As we talk about radical welcome, there are two parts to it that we'll cover, right? There's the first part, which is how I see and perceive myself. And we practice presume welcome. So I know that I'm worthy, that I am enough, that I bring value to this webinar. And then there's the other part of radical welcome on how we receive people, how we receive the others, right? So it's understanding that people are perfect, whole, and complete. And most times it's our systems that are broken. So we have to work on how do we work with the people within the systems to improve them. Our communities are perfect, our families are perfect, perfect, whole, and complete. There are areas for improvement always, but there are no broken people, there are no throwaway people. Next slide. And we look at the Sankofa bird, which has its feet firmly planted on the ground, and it looks back to the past and says, we learn from the past, go back and fetch it, right? So there's always this question, as individuals, as a family, as a community, as an organization, and as a system, how did we get here? How did we get here? Because without knowing that, without understanding how we got here, there's no way to chart the new course, right? And again, there's this Eurocentric value that the solutions lie in the future. But people have been solving the challenges that we wrestle with. People have been solving the challenges that we're wrestling with for some time. I had a friend tell me earlier today, we were having a conversation around the DEI work that we're doing with one organization, and she said, we've been telling them the same things for 20 years. The folks that have been doing this work, that have been screaming from their lungs, we're not saying anything new, it's just people are starting to listen. So it's not this either or dichotomous thinking of you can either be in the present or the future or the past. It's how do we have this continuum of thought, right? Next slide. So again, systems are made up of people, and people show up as their true selves. So people bring the trauma with them into the systems. When we work with teams, the work that we've done, we ask people, there's this idea, this misconception of leave it at the door that we tell people in their work settings as they're designing teams, as we're designing organizations, as we're designing settings, we say, leave it at the door. What we say is bring all of you to the table. And Russ really started us with that. So if my mother's dying of leukemia, that's gonna show up. It's gonna show up. So we should say, how do we create space for me to be fully present, for my experiences to be affirmed? I mean, if you're watching the news, there are painful things that are occurring in the news. If we're showing up in organizations and systems and no one's talking about them, then we're creating a toxic environment where people are fragmented. You know, if we're not talking about the fact that there's a pandemic going on and that people's lives are changing, then we're creating a toxic environment where people are fragmented, right? So we say hurt people unintentionally develop systems that harm, but can intentionally develop systems that heal. So how do we intentionally develop healing systems, intentionally develop systems where people can be whole, where people can show up as their full selves? So when we talk about the tree model and we say trauma-informed care, restorative practices, emotional intelligence, and equity, the restorative practice piece of radical welcome, right, the restorative practices part, is how do we treat one another when we don't show up as our best selves? Because part of being your whole self is to know that there'll be days that I don't show up as you know, the Hassan that you're looking forward to seeing. How do we treat people? Do you vote me off the island? I tell a story that I was kicked out of kindergarten. I was left back in 7th grade. I spent 3 years in the 9th grade, and it was all centered around me not showing up as my best self in moments, and rather than people embrace me, because in the moments when we need connectivity within systems, what do? We oftentimes other people and alienate people and push them away and reject them. So when we talk about the trauma within systems and creating healing systems, we're saying, how do we create systems that nurture people, that rejuvenate people, that restore people, and that remind us of the best that's within us and that's amongst us. And that's intentional. That's going in with that idea. Next slide. And trauma happens, as we know, on an individual level, on a family level, on a community level, and on a systems level. And we always want to focus on the individuals and the families in this society. I started off my academic career as a social worker because I thought that I could heal my family and break the cycles if I understood and made different decisions, and if I taught my family to make different decisions. And then with time, we realize that there are systems, there are structural things that exist. And again, as we say, systems are made up of people. So how do we work with people? How do we work with healing to bring about those structural changes within the systems? Next slide. And again, right, we have to get to the root causes. When we talk about trauma, it's not always the way that trauma manifests itself. It's what are the root causes, and what are the things that we're seeing that show up on a systems level, across communities, across organizations? How do we get to the root causes of the trauma that's impacting the individuals, the families, and the communities that we serve? Rather than, again, this Western thought of this individualism, that these are behaviors that this individual is displaying that need to be corrected, rather than recognizing that there are glitches in the matrix, that people are responding appropriately to difficult situations, to trauma that they're experiencing. Next slide. So when we talk about intentionally designing systems that foster healing, it's often centered around the questions that we ask in our design, in our co-design, the questions that we ask. So we would ask the question, what would a system look like if it systematically fostered healing? What would a system look like if it systematically fostered healing? And again, with the understanding that systems are made up of people, and we know that hurt people, and that people that are healed have the ability to transform themselves and transform systems. So how do we commit and invest in designing systems that support the restoration, the rejuvenation, and the healing of the people that are within them? How do we prioritize the people? Next slide. Radical welcome. We asked you earlier, what does it look like when you feel welcomed, right? And we got, the words were beautiful. We got words that allow you to show up different and show up as your best selves. We all know what it feels like to be rejected. We all know what it feels like to be othered. We all know what it feels like to be pushed out, to be kicked out. Most of us, right, on some level, know this. And we know that people show up different when they have those experiences. So I think of this bienvenidos when I enter spaces, and I see that it just says to me, like, really, like, welcome, and in a very colorful and active way, right? Or I go back to the first day of kindergarten, because we know what it felt like, if not for us, for our parents or our caregivers or loved ones, whoever took us to the first day of kindergarten. And we're talking about pre-pandemic kindergarten, right? Where you were dropped off maybe for your first time, you were scared, you were anxious, you were crying. Many of us live those feelings every day. Most of the rooms that I go in, meetings and boards and things like that, I'm the only person of color, definitely the only Black male, without a shadow of a doubt. So when I step into those spaces, there's an anxiety that comes over me, just looking around the room, right? Radical welcome has two parts. There's the presumed welcome, so I have to remind myself, because we have whispers. We have whispers of our uncle when we were 3 years old telling us we're not enough. We have whispers of the teachers with the red pens telling us we're not enough. We have whispers of the officer that pulled us over. We have whispers. I have whispers of the juvenile justice facility folks telling me I'm going to die in a pool of my own blood, that I'd never be anything. They're whispering to me when I enter a space with the CEOs of the foundations. You are not enough to be in this room. Who do you think you are? And then that's when that imposter syndrome comes into play, right? So we're saying from a radical welcome perspective, there are messages that we tell ourselves, legitimate, authentic messages that are about presumed welcome. I know I belong, and this is why I belong. This is who I am. That silences and drowns out all of the naysayers and all of the whispers in my ear. And the second part of it is what the teacher hopefully did on the first day of kindergarten. There are signs everywhere. There are smiles. And it's like when I enter that room, there are people that say, we are glad you are here. Of all the places you could have chosen to have been, we are excited that you chose to be here with us. And when I speak to myself that way, and when I'm received that way, when my greatness and my contribution is affirmed, I show up different every time. And the other part of radical welcome is even when I don't show up as my best self, where people continue to believe and invest in me and invest in the system and say, we're not going to vote you off the island. Next slide. So we just have some bullets and some reminders. This is very brief, really to just stimulate some conversation. We are inviting people to really in this work to understand what does it look like to listen and show up as an ally, as an accomplice, as a co-conspirator. What does radical welcome look like? What does healing look like? And how we're contributing to systems is something we talk about that is a duty to act. You know, when you see a foul on the play, there are a couple things that I'm not a sports person, but a couple things that I've learned from sports is one is they stop the clock, and they give people an opportunity to get up, to heal, to walk it off. You know, so when there's a foul on the play within our systems, how do we stop the clock and give people a moment? And the other part is the duty to act. How do we call it? How do we name it? How do we use our power and our privilege? How do we use our space and our opportunity to create the systems that we want to create the healing? Every opportunity and engagement with people is an opportunity to strengthen a relationship or to deteriorate it. So how do we show up in the spaces that we show up every day in a way that builds radical welcome, that fosters healing, and that builds systems change that's intergenerational? Next slide. And then we talk about these Eurocentric values that are really grounded in white supremacy, that focus on perfectionism. Everything has to be perfect. The way I walk, the way I talk, the way I complete the report. Like there are systems that are designed around ideals that are false, that are designed for us to fail. And it creates this fear of failure. When really what we want is we want to create systems that encourage failure, that encourage people to fail forward, to take risks, to be courageous, to be brave, to step up, to step out, to stretch themselves, to try something different, and to show up as their true selves, and to not practice and foster imposter syndrome. Because it harms all of us, and it harms what we're looking to build. Other parts of it are as it focuses on measurement and evaluation. Everything doesn't have to be counted and measured. Some things we know intuitively. Some things we use narrative to tell the story, to talk about the impact. We have to place value on those spaces. There is a place for measurement and evaluation, of course, but to just focus on that, to only know that it's real if it's been documented, is a Eurocentric value that doesn't fit into all paradigms and all communities, right? To be future focused, to always look at what are we going to do versus taking a step back and reflecting and thinking about what have we done, what has got us up to here, whose shoulders do we stand on, who are the ancestors and who are the elders in the work that we do in the systems that we live, who are the people that have contributed to creating this system. And then this focus on control, right? Systems that are focused on control, we know are creating these toxic environments. So, next slide. So we have some of these slides are here just for your reflection. This one just talks about the different pillars of radical welcome. You know, we relinquish power, which is a huge one. When we talk about equity, when we talk about welcome, how do we get there? We have to be willing to relinquish power. We have to be willing to relinquish it, to share it, to give, to create space for people, to expand the table, to take some risk. And you know, the most toxic systems don't do that. I'm not going to go through all of these. Next slide. This just talks about what does relinquishing power look like. We always incorporate food, of course, in our work. You know, that's what we do. That's how we build. So again, right? Who are the people that have contributed to building the system? What are the stories? What are the practices? What are the norms? One of ours is food. Next slide. What does authentic engagement look like? Listening to people. I have a dear friend that's Phyllis Alexander that always tells me active listening is a revolutionary act, is what she says. Active listening is a revolutionary act. There's an exercise that we often do where we say, just listen to someone for 3 minutes and what it feels like. You know, and we're still talking about systems because systems are made up of people. So when people feel heard, when people feel affirmed, when people realize that the connection that they have as they develop policies, one of the questions we ask as we develop policies, we say, how is this going to impact the most oppressed amongst us? The other question is, how is this specifically contributing to the liberation of our people? So how is this policy, how is this practice going to impact the most oppressed amongst us, the most marginalized amongst us? How is this going to impact them? And how specifically has this contributed to the liberation of our people? Next slide. My wife is a gardener, and she often tells me how all of my work sounds just like permaculture, because I believe that we are capable, people possess self-healing capabilities, and that is through relationships, right? So I'm not saying on an island off to ourselves, but we have to provide supportive environments, we have to provide nurturing environments, and we also talk about this idea of rejection, exclusion, othering, pushing people out, suspending kids, arresting children. All of these things are acts of violence, and they interrupt the healing process. We often push out those that are calling out for the most healing. Next slide. Compensation is critical, right? Next slide. So we're on to the next next slide. You can take this down to the end, Russ, so that we can there you go, fishbowl discussion.
Hassan, I'm impressed you covered all that in that short period of time. Thank you for that.
The struggle that we're having, right, is knowing how do we, and many people are wrestling with this, so if you can figure it out, please let us know. How do we create relationships virtually in this work, right? Because if we were in a room together, we'd have the energy of one another, we'd have the nods, the thumbs up, we'd know where there were questions. So we're really trying to figure out, we're new at this, and that's part of that authenticity, being honest. This is new to us. How do we cover all of this? How do we build relationships and do this work from a virtual space?
Yeah, and create that radical welcome in the virtual space.
Right.
So we want to shift in a second here to the fishbowl discussion. I'll just remind people that the Slido poll is open, and some folks are contributing and upvoting things within that. So we're going to visit that in a bit as part of the fishbowl discussion, and also invite other people at some point to share some reflections in the group too. So here's a fishbowl discussion. It's essentially, if we were in a room, we'd have a large circle with 78 people or something sitting around the outside. And then we'd have a small circle of maybe 5 chairs in the middle of the room. And if you are going to talk, if you're going to participate in the discussion, you have to be sitting in one of the 5 chairs in the middle. And so we're going to start with 5 chairs, and our chairs are going to be, if your video is on, you're in that inside circle. If your video is off, then you're in the outside circle. So we're going to ask everyone now, please turn off your video. Hassan and Melissa and I will stay. And I'd also like to invite Chris and Sable to leave your videos on as well. And that'll be our starting group. And as any one of us kind of thinks, okay, I've kind of said enough, I'm done. I will, for example, turn off my video, and that's a chance for someone who's in the outside circle to turn on your video and join the discussion. So let's just make sure we have 5 chairs or 5 videos on at any given time. And if you're interested in joining the Fishbowl, you could put a note into the chat to let people know. So I'll stop my share here. And I see Sable and Chris. Hello.
Hello there.
Hello.
Hi.
All
to be
right.
here.
Thank you guys for joining the circle.
Yeah.
It's good
So-
to be a fish.
We'll see if it's good to be in the fishbowl, but fish don't seem to mind it. All right. So maybe let's just start with the reflection from each of you. Sable, maybe we could start with you and then go to Chris. And Melissa, I know we asked you to share a particular story. So you might share that or any other reflections that have come up for you. And then we'll just kind of let the conversation evolve. And at any point, one of us turns off her video, that's a sign for someone else to join.
Yeah, so all of this is resonating so incredibly deeply. And so I work primarily with school system leaders, and I try to help them design systems that function at the operation of, at the intersection of equity and instruction. And so much of this work is healing work, and is so much of it is, you know, sort of unpacking the trauma that led people to make these decisions so that they have an opportunity and space to like see it, acknowledge it, and release it. And really, I find that without that, we stay stuck, and we stay stuck because to your point of, you know, people are perfect, whole, and complete, and it's our systems that are broken. We stay stuck when we treat our systems as perfect, whole, and complete, and as people that are broken and are confused, frustrated. So many things happen when we treat it as the reverse. And so I'm really appreciating all the language that you're putting to this. So many of these principles I see in my own personal life, and I try to bring to professional, to the work I do professionally. And I just, I'm really loving the language and just like the acknowledgement around, you know, this is, we are human and we have trauma with us. And the scary thing isn't acknowledging it. That's actually the first step to progress and to growth and healing and change.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chris, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Sable said. The language is very helpful. As someone who is trained as a storyteller, I welcome and I look forward to ripping off your language and using it as much as I can. Perhaps because I use an inquiry-based approach in my work, I particularly love the question that you asked: what would a system look like if it systemically fostered healing, right? And that I've found that when we ask compelling questions like that, new questions, right? And I've never heard that question asked before. And so many of our systems are full of trauma. It's, to me, a question I look forward to asking. I would like to, I guess, push back and get your perspective when you said not everything can be measured. Some things we know intrinsically. We need to value narrative. I guess my pushback would be we can measure narrative and we can measure the intrinsic. We just choose not to, because when we use the word measure, we put quantitative above qualitative, right? And I think if we took a step back and asked ourselves what data matters, it's not just the quantitative. I think just if you were given 3 minutes to explore that question and listen to people answer that question, to go back to your earlier language, I'm pretty sure 90% of the folks in the room would say quantitative and qualitative measurement matters. Too often we just rely on the quantitative, and that obviously is insufficient because we are the stories we choose to tell.
Yeah, that's it.
I just want you to kind of talk more about the role of narrative and what your experience has been with people maybe dismissing it because it wasn't something they could measure in a quantitative way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a power play, right? People want to control the narrative. I mean, it's a tool of oppression. So they want to silence. They want to silence folks and ignore them and dismiss them. And people's stories matter, and language matters. And I mean, we see it today. I mean, things are real before they're recorded. Before the camera or the video was turned on, I knew what my experiences were. But you don't believe them unless you see them, and we hear it. So yeah, I'm talking about quantitative when I say counting and measuring, and we need to learn to listen to people. We need to put weight on people's stories, and we need to affirm people's experiences. One of the things that I talk to when I work with clinicians or docs and with training folks, we say, when people tell you they're in pain, believe them. And it's really centered in that. It's something one of my mentors has taught me that's called the art of believing. So when people tell you you're in pain, you believe them, and you move from that space. You center your diagnosis and your prognosis and your treatment and around the stories that people are telling you, their real life experience.
Can I also share, hearing that made me think about the whole idea of measurement and the power behind it. Makes me think of just looking at the nonprofit sector and thinking about the different organizations that are able to get the different amounts of funding based off of what they're able to quantify and what they can measure, and how that sort of leads to disproportionate amounts of funding towards different kinds of work. To your point, just because it's real before it's reported, the need is there, even if it hasn't been sort of like distilled into sort of like this container that is easy to assess, or easy to assess from a particular perspective. So that's that's a connection that it made me think of when I heard of your question as well.
Thank you, guys.
And Chris jumped out of the circle here, so I think we'll welcome Kathleen. And Melissa, how about you?
So, one of the things that I've been sitting with was this idea that listening can be a revolutionary act. And it reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, and that is that people begin to heal the moment they feel heard. And I was recently involved in an initiative where sort of these things came together in the form of a graphic novel, actually, as a resource for a small community in California. And the goal of the graphic novel was to describe how did we get here, or the story of the community. And so to understand the past, to understand where we are now, and then to inspire where we might go together. But it's a really interesting and complex story that we tell, and how it gets told and what stories get centered and elevated are an important part of that healing. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Del Norte County is a very small rural community in Northern California. It has 4 federally recognized indigenous communities, a fairly significant Hmong population. It's agricultural. It's the lily bulb capital of the world. So any of you from around the United States who are buying Easter lilies, they've probably come from this place I'm describing. They had economies of extraction after European contact, and it's now home to a supermax prison. So lots of things to tease out. And if the question is, how did we get here? Then the next question is, who is the we? So there's a challenge to tell the story of genocide in a place where both the descendants of the people who committed those acts and the survivors of those atrocities enroll their kids in the same small high school, right? So in thinking about what got included and excluded from this story, there was lots of pressure to de-emphasize certain policies or certain decisions. And there was significant pressure from people in elected positions or positions of power and authority in the community to retell sort of a revisionist version of history that simply just isn't based in truth. So we had to figure out how to balance those things and create a resource, which I will share with you in the email that I send later this week, that really encapsulated, and you will let me know if we did this well or not, if we were successful in being able to sit with the past and be firmly grounded in those things, in all of its ugliness and complexity, and also the hope and joy that exists there too. And then really wanting to use that to understand how we would shape the story of where we want to go together. So the future isn't written yet. We have a shared destiny, but we can't figure out what systems change might look like, or what systems we need to impact, or how we might impact them without knowing how we got here. So this idea of active listening and people feeling heard and validated in their stories and in their trauma is really powerful for me today.
And Melissa and I have a mutual friend. This is how recent the history is there. Her grandfather was born on a rock, basically out in the Pacific Ocean, to get away from the bounty hunters who were getting paid bounties by the governor of California for each native scalp that they acquired. That's how recent the history was here, and yet it was so difficult to be able to even tell stories that were that recent. We have Kathleen, and is it Sybil? Welcome.
Hi, I had to unmute. Hello.
It looks like we could have some other people join the inner circle here too. People are popping out pretty quickly. But how about Kathleen and Sybil? What do you want to share?
I can follow. Okay. So about when Hassan was saying about believing people's stories and whatnot, that kind of, resonated with me, being someone that's younger, and sometimes I'm able to be in rooms, like even just sitting in on this webinar, listening. This is stuff that a lot of people my age, I know that they don't do. And I'm one of very few of my friends that can say I've gone through a lot of trauma, and instead of, turning to drugs and partying and other things, I've actually sat down and read books on how to heal from my trauma. I watch people's, YouTubes that are like older and into, psychology and whatnot, and I listen to them. And then when I'm in like a psychology class, I go above and beyond what the assignment was if I feel like it was something, that resonated with me, especially as far as like childhood adverse experiences and stuff. Like last year, I was going through a lot, and I was reading the book, listening to the audiobook. I do not recommend anybody doing this while going through it, but it was The Deepest Well by, I think, Nadine Burke. And I was listening to that, and it was like so triggering that I didn't even realize it until it was too late, And then, so I went through a whole short story shorter, long year of a lot of stuff going on last year. And it was like every day I had to literally wake up and tell myself, like, it's just the trauma triggering, you know what I mean? And kind of like bring myself out of it to being able to move forward and live in like what the present is. So then moving forward to the present, to bring that back around, when I meet people and like, you know, we're talking about something, I think that just automatically someone will see you and assume that like you didn't go through anything. You know what I mean? Like I walk around with 2 little dogs that have bows and dresses. So there's no way that girl's been through all kinds of emotional abuse and, you know, whatnot. So that's one of the things. And then as far as like the systems and how to bring people into them and whatnot, like, you know, how Hassan had said, the systems are made up of people. You know, like when we look at social media, that was one thing I thought of. I'm into the whole social media world as far as YouTube and whatnot. So when we look at that, there's a lot of disagreements going on all the time, and there's constant arguing, and that's what's highlighted the most. But if social media is a system and it's made up by people, which is all of us, if there was not a profile individually on there, we wouldn't have it. It wouldn't exist. But the problem that I see the most being like, especially on Twitter, where people are arguing, it's just because everybody's bringing their own trauma or their lack of trauma. So you have either someone that's like coming, speaking on a topic, saying like, I've watched someone killed in front of me, you know, that's my passion. And then someone who's never experienced any of that coming with their own trauma or their own just opinions on it. That's where, you know, we have that divide. So I wanted to say, you know, as far as that part moving forward, just to be done, because I took my notes. I was taking my notes, so I didn't forget anything. But yeah, so then the other thing was, you know, like social media is what it is right now. It's being built. So everybody wants, you know, conversations to happen the same way we have them in person, and that's just not going to happen. Being on another side of a screen, everyone, no matter what, has that little bit of security. As like, I could say whatever I want to you, and nothing is going to happen to me in this moment because you're all the way over on the other side of the world. So that's just what it is. And we need to learn how to start talking on there. And I think that people who like to be the peacemakers really do have to start putting their voice out instead of just sitting quietly, because I'm a firm believer, if there's a right and a wrong and you stay quiet, you're automatically with the wrong. Like no matter what, you just lost right then and there and went over to that side, as far as that. But when we are looking at like a system saying like, this system's broken and we need to fix it, and everybody's like, okay, great, let's just start fixing it. Like sometimes something does have to be completely dismantled, taken down to the bones, if it's possible. If you look at like the government, not to go too far into that, obviously that's what I was pointing, but looking at that, you can't completely get rid of it. Like everything would stop. COVID has shown how much just a pandemic will stop how we just function. And people are trying to figure out how to like, how do we get back to pre-COVID? You can't. You have to just say from today forward, how do we move forward, you know, as far as kids and schooling and, you know, daycare and things like that. Like there is no pre-COVID. Like it just does not exist whatsoever. So if we're going to dismantle our government, you know, as far as the justice system and then the police brutality and all these things, some of that stuff has to be completely stop, pause. Tomorrow we wake up, this is exactly how it runs from today. But then when everybody brings in, you know, new voices and fresh thoughts, our stories get silenced because, you know, say like we're younger or we don't have the same, I might not come with a bunch of degrees, but maybe I just didn't have the time to go through school because I was actually going through it. You know what I mean? So then my voice is automatically silenced, usually from the beginning. And I was the one that had put fear when he was talking about the radical welcome. For me, like every time I walk into a space and everybody's like, no, we want you here. We want to hear your voice. We want to know what you got to say. I get scared because I'm like, yeah, but until I say what? And that is like the fear, I think, because that's usually what I experience is I walk into a room and everybody wants to hear my voice until I say something that's like, oh no, that makes us uncomfortable. And then I get silent. So I feel like I'm always waiting for like the boom. So I'm gonna silence me before y'all do. Okay, go ahead.
Sybil, we'll take a few more minutes with Kathleen, Sage, and Karen, and then I want to invite Hassan back, and we'll do a bit of just reflection on what's been shared. Sybil, that picture of you walking your 2 little dogs with the bows and the dresses, you know, people will look and they'll see these signs, right? These indicators that somehow mean something to them. And it struck me that the biggest barrier, I don't know you, Sybil, right? But the biggest barrier to me seeing you is the you in my head.
Mm.
Whatever patterns, history, pictures, stories, narratives, whatever I have kind of floating in my head. So it's like, and I can probably never really truly see you, but to keep trying maybe is part of the work. So let's hear from Kathleen,
I,
Sage, and
I
Karen.
agree. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I was muted.
First, just to appreciate Co-Creative for pulling these things together, and Dr. Betts, this is really amazing for me and is a kind of nutrition in this time. So I just wanted to start by saying thanks. And I have so many things running through my head and heart. So they're not necessarily connected, but here are a couple. When I first started my career, I ran restorative justice circles, and I've been thinking a lot about those lately, and about the power of community-based narrative and about the dispensability with which we treat people who are somehow busted for perpetrating a crime or a transgression, as opposed to treating people as parts of the whole. So I love, as others have expressed, the meme of people aren't broken, systems are. So this idea that, for me, that I've always loved about restorative justice, that if something happens in the community, whether you label that a crime or not, but a transgression of whatever sort, that there's a way for the community to take responsibility, as well as for the individual to take responsibility. And I've been thinking about that a lot, about whether in this period in our history, these unprecedented times, how to create space for those kinds of conversations that do provide healing. And it's always, in my sort of playbook on ground rules as a mediator and facilitator, I often talk about how important it is to acknowledge the past, but not to rehash it. And I'm really rethinking that lately, because I think in some ways what I'm learning, or what's kind of landing with me today, is that idea of whose shoulders are we standing on, right? How did we actually get here? And acknowledging that as a means of then moving forward into the bigger picture. And the last thing, she went away, Sybil. I was thinking about listening to your story. I love the picture of the dogs and the bows too. I thought that was great. But I was also thinking about a book that I read and a course I took a while ago called The Art of Possibility. And they have their ground rules. I think there are 7. I can only remember the first 2. And it sort of goes to your point, Russ. The first 2 are, whatever you're thinking, it's a projection. It's your own stuff. So give them an A. Like, whoever you're seeing, whatever they're doing, just give them an A. Now, and I've already forgotten the second one. Shoot. I'll find a link and put it into the I'll put a link into the chat. But just that idea of giving people an A, and that we're not dispensable because we've had a transgression, that we're bigger than our transgressions, I feel like is so important. And I feel like it's the only way to get out of what might otherwise be a cultural black hole that we're crawling down. So I'm really keen. I really appreciate everything I'm hearing, and those are my random thoughts.
I just wanted to say that's my problem, I think, is I project that automatically that's going to happen because it's happened so often. So that's why when you said that, I'm like, yeah. And then I was like, oh, wait, no, she's saying like the person is giving me, and like, I don't do that. I automatically, I'm like, oh, yeah. No, it's happening. It's going to happen.
We all co-create. That's kind of the thing. Right? Like, if we all co-create together, we could get to this better place, but we've got to step into that.
And intentionally is what we're talking about, right? So we're talking intentionally creating the systems and the world that we want. And I just want to share, I also started in doing these restorative circles. So I feel you. I'm here with you on that. And we want to create systems that accept responsibility for the wins and the losses. So there's a, I forget where it is, but there's an indigenous group that when someone commits a crime, when a harm is done, and Kathleen, you may be familiar with this, they circle around the person and they remind them of their greatness. They affirm all that's powerful within them, rather than, locking them up, cuffing them. They say because I was told by another one of my mentors, Dr. Jones. He said the diagnosis dictates the treatment. The diagnosis dictates the treatment. So when I was diagnosed as incorrigible as a youth, when I was diagnosed as a criminal, we know how we treat criminals. The treatment already exists. So if I was diagnosed as misguided, then you would offer me guidance. But once you diagnose me as a perpetrator of violence, then there's one place that you have to send me. You have one option.
Russ, could I just say one more quick thing?
We'll need to move to Sage and Karen to have time to get into our small group.
I'll pass, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, folks. And yeah, thank you to everyone who shared so far. I've just been kind of absorbing all of the wisdom and feeling really grateful for it. I think the thing that keeps coming to mind as I'm listening to all of you is something about truth, and thinking, when I think about systems and what systems I exist within, I think about white supremacy, and I think about capitalism and how much harm that does to us on a daily basis. And what I notice within myself in the here and now is that my soul feels really full up, but not in a good way, in a really hurt way, by being part of a system that only wants your label, that only wants your labor, your capital, rather than being able to exist in your truth in the moment and bring what you want to bring, what you can share and co-create, that comes from you. And yeah, hearing Hassan, oh, my mind's gone blank. Where was I going? I think about work quite a lot, paid work, and when one's values don't match up with the system that you're working within, and how does your soul get depleted by that? And how do you exist in a system that doesn't want you to survive, that wants to harm you, that benefits in lots of ways from your harm? How do you move through the system? How do you survive a system that doesn't want you to, and stay true to yourself, your story, your history, the things that would allow you to heal? I think that's maybe where I'm at the moment, and from listening with you all.
Thank you, Sage. So Karen is one of the people working on what those new systems might look like.
Thank you, Russ, and thank you so much for everyone's contribution to the conversation. I'm very present right now to the past, in my own past, of working in an organisation called the Hunger Project. And hunger is not the same, the chronic persistence of hunger is not the same as famine. So in a system where we think hunger is about food, exactly what was said about the diagnosis will prescribe the solution. What was investigated is that the chronic persistence of hunger was about the subjugation and marginalisation of women when they didn't have the resources, the education and the support and empowerment to lead flourishing lives, or to lead lives of productivity and prosperity. So I'm very present to this notion of subjugation and marginalisation, and what that presents itself as in trauma, when people are humiliated, subjugated and marginalised, and that starts to become part of their nervous system and how they respond to the world and the stories they tell about themselves. And I work in human flourishing, and what I've noticed, I've had some clients recently, and I want to presence COVID-19 because I think it's taken the lid off trauma. I think it's taken the lid off many things in this conversation that couldn't be talked about before. And the doctors and the news reporters say that people are getting the COVID-19 virus because of underlying conditions, whether it's age, obesity, many different conditions, whether it's asthma or heart conditions. But out of the people I've spoken to, what's been amazing to me and the clients I've had is the underlying conditions are actually systemic. They're systemic in their system of burnout, leading lives that they were compromising their values, leading lives where they were working 16-hour days. So that's not talked about as an underlying condition of trauma. And some of them I've spoken to have said they've never cried in their lives, they've never been heard, they've never been seen. and then they're presented with a failed condition of fear in their system and survival in their system that can't cope with the virus that comes at them. Now, I'm not saying that's a solution. I just want to presence that the underlying conditions that you were speaking about, that have been spoken about today, of trauma and burnout and the system that we have signed up for, but now many of us are recognizing doesn't serve us, is we have to take our agency now, and as has been said in the conversation today, really reinforce ourselves with the moral obligation to heal, to listen, and to bring forth the compassion we need to have for people to really bring themselves forward and to flourish. So I just want to acknowledge that, but also for all of us to recognize the patterns that we inhabit that we haven't taken care of or interrupted. And it's our responsibility to do so more than ever before. So thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you for sharing, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. Melissa, I think maybe let's take some time in breakout rooms. You want to, I could put the question into the chat here. You're muted.
I said, thank you, that would be great. So before, we do want to give you guys the opportunity to talk more intimately among yourselves. But before we do that, I'm going to invite you to do a silent reflection. Spend about 2 minutes thinking about a time when you felt radically welcomed into a moment or into a space or into an experience. What were you seeing? What were you hearing that contributed to that space? Just take some notes to yourself and silently going back to that moment of radical welcome. What did it look like? What did it feel like? What did it sound like? Okay, Russ, if I could have the instruction slide up on the screen, please. What we're going to do now is we're going to break into groups of 3, and we're going to give you the opportunity to share these experiences with the folks in your triad. So each person is going to have approximately 4 minutes to describe their radical welcome. And we want to encourage you to practice empathic listening. So avoid giving advice if it's at all possible, and give folks that revolutionary act of feeling radically listened to.
All right, so this is what emerged. So a lot of energy around, we forget how much we bring with us into a room and all the stories that are constantly interacting and often misunderstanding each other.
That's right.
We had this theme of not broken people, broken systems. I think there were actually a couple that got some votes related to that idea.
Yeah, it gives us a different framework, a different way to approach solutions.
Oh, this must be the pacing of the welcome for the webinar. That's good. So maybe we're practicing what we're talking about to some extent. This from Chris here. A number of people resonated with this. People are whole, perfect, and complete. Systems are broken. So another version of that reminds me of the saying that each of us is perfectly adapted to our experiences and context.
Hmm. I think I saw someone's picture said like radical psychiatry, and that's what it really talks about, right? Like that it's the systems, it's not the people.
And I'm just going to stay on this one here, acknowledging Jacob Blake.
Thank you, Jacob.
Well, I tried to stay on it. There we go.
So there's this conversation around inclusion of systems and leadership and decision makers reflecting the people that are being served. And there's a part of it that's grounded in the fact that people bring real experiences with them. So when the systems are designed by people that are protected or privileged from those experiences, then it's easier for them to silence them or dismiss them because they're not part of their reality. So Jacob spoke to the Black experience in America that's real and that's been real. And had we had more Black folks around the table, we would know that.
All right, so we'll share these out with everyone afterward. There's a lot more here. It looks like 73. And it looks like more topics for discussion in the future. I'm going to activate the last poll in Slido. So again, you can contribute, you can also upvote. And what I'm going to suggest is we don't reveal this here, partly because of time, but partly because it'll leave us with a gift for later. So if everyone can contribute and upvote as you see fit, this is one of the gifts we'll share after the webinar. This reminds me of a great exercise that Sharif Abdullah, who's author of Creating a World That Works for All. Sharif does this exercise where he says, I want you to picture a world where art is the highest value. Art is held in the highest regard. And he asks the audience for adjectives to describe that world. So beautiful, insightful, compelling, whatever. And then he gives other values like the elderly. Imagine a world in which the elderly are what's held in highest regard. And the punchline is, after he's done maybe 5 or 6 of these really beautiful kind of aspects, he says, now I want you to imagine a world in which money is the thing that's most valued. And of course, everyone just bursts out laughing. But really connecting to the values that we want to design a world around together. It's a beautiful exercise. So Sharif, anything else that you want to share? We want to share appreciation for you.
Were you talking to me?
Yeah.
I
I'm sorry. I was
Sharif.
thinking of Sharif.
Yeah. It took me a moment because I'm looking, I'm like, I don't see a Sharif. But
Sharif is always over my shoulder.
that's a good name to have, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to share that we're living it, you know, so we have to create these spaces and multiply and ripple it. I mean, I feel extremely welcomed in this space. I mean, from the smiles to the engagement, to the nods, the attentiveness, and this is how we do it, right? We're often responding to the trauma that people have experienced, and we can either further exacerbate the pain, or we can help it to heal. So I want to thank you guys for creating a space and for showing up in a way and for being vulnerable, many of you, that fosters growth and love and learning. So for showing up, and then after you showed up, for making the decision to show up.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Be well.